Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I feel somewhat back at the NAC listening to these presentations. I'm very much impressed by Professor Hilde's presentation of the decision-making apparatus, bewildering as it might seem. I mean, this is the ideal way of doing it. In practice, of course, it is a bit more complicated and a bit more bewildering. Also, of course, it is easy to point to things which is at miss. But let me start by agreeing that much has been done in in NATO over the last 4 years to bring the organization back to its core task of collective defense. New plans, command structure, exercises, enhanced forward presence, etc. So much has been done. Equally clear is it that much remains. I think when you are talking about decision-making in NATO, moving at the glacial speed the previous panelist said that there is no real debate in the NAC anymore. I tend to disagree to a certain extent. Of course, there are debates there, but there is also a limit to how much you can introduce into the discussions at NAC. I mean, basically, and I think that is something which really needs to be underlined, NATO allies agree to cooperate on the issues they agree to cooperate on. I mean, this sounds like a platitude, but it's really, what this is all about. You do not, for instance, bring in criticism of individual allies into the everyday discussions at NAC. You do not introduce issues which you know will break the unity. But that does not mean that it is not moving forward. You need to voice your views. You need to build, of course, as you do in all international gatherings, support for your views. And you need to concentrate on issues which are of real importance. I mean, for Norway, over the last 4 years, we have been concentrating very much on the reform of the command structure, on the emphasis on the sea line of communications across the Atlantic. This has been a conscious choice on part of the Norwegian government, and we have had some results on that. As a Norwegian perm rep, that was in a way my Carthago delenda est moment in the NAC, when I was always bringing up these issues and people were starting laughing. I mean, here the crazy Norwegian goes again. But you have to stick at it. So, what characterizes NATO as an organization? This is fundamentally, of course, a military organization, but it's also fundamentally a very political organization. It is certainly political-led. It is designed for United States leadership, and it is fundamentally aimed at deterring a rational state actor and providing stability in the Euro-Atlantic area. So consensus is something you build gradually in the everyday decision-making process. It moves at the glacial speed when it's not under pressure. But when we look back, we see that much has actually been achieved over the last 4 years, even with that approach. When it comes to the response in crisis, it is obviously easier if the situation is unambiguous, as it was back in 2001, or if we are faced with a traditional military aggression, tanks crossing the border. That is pretty clear. And in the debate so far today, I kind of have a feeling that we are focusing perhaps a little bit too much on that scenario, a strictly conventional military scenario. I mean, even if a conventional aggression were to happen, there is nowhere written that this should be met in a symmetrical way. There are a number of tools in the toolbox to respond horizontally. And let me stress, since this is being being in the public domain, I'm not advocating the use of nuclear weapons. You're supposed to snigger on that, but you didn't. You were quite serious. Of course, there are economic means of responding. You don't have to respond in the same domain. You don't have to respond in the same place. So the situation is a bit more complicated than just thinking in terms of conventional aggression being met by conventional means. The situation is, of course, far less easy if the situation is more unclear, if attribution is more difficult. We saw that when the alliance was in the process of responding to the Russian aggression against Ukraine in 2014. It took quite a long time in NAC to agree on a common position. That was not because it was not obvious who were behind the little green man, but because the implications of reaching that decision were so grave. So, and of course this applies even more when we are turning to new threats like cyber terror and the other, and as we, in lack of a better word, call hybrid situations, which is probably where we will see the next conflict emerging. There will always be a possibility of deniability. There will always be national political considerations to take into account. So, as was advocated here, I mean, the need for responsiveness, of course, I mean, to act quickly, to respond to an aggression. Yes, but there is a trade-off here with political control, as was pointed out by Professor Elhus. And we have seen that. I mean, when you're looking at the fantastic presentation by Professor Hilde, the question of where do you really take the crucial decisions? When have you devolved so much authority to secure that the political leadership really take the back seat and the crisis gathers its own momentum and moves ahead without really on-hand political control? I mean, we know this challenge, but it's in a national context, but it's amplified when you're dealing with 29 democratic countries. There is, I think, quite legitimate hesitancy on part of democratically elected national governments to transfer too much authority in advance, because people realize that this could be where you really make at the end of the day, the fundamental decision of war and peace. And that is really, I mean, the most important decision a national government can make. So we will, I think, also in the future be faced with this conundrum. The need for speed, the need for responsiveness, but at the same time, the need to maintain what is essential to NATO, the political control of military use of military might. Right, yeah. So I agree with those who have said that in a real situation, much will depend, or rather everything will depend on the ability of the country in question to convince the allies that an aggression is really taking place. And crucial, of course, in this is to convince the main allies. You will not get anywhere without having convinced the United States of America that this is the situation. I mean, this is essential to the NATO cooperation. I said that NATO is fundamentally designed for US leadership. It will be very, very difficult to envisage any action taking place under the NATO umbrella without US participation. And I mean, seen from a Norwegian perspective, this is where we've always been. I mean, this is the reason, one of the reasons at least, why we have been conducted exercises with our American friends and allies in Norway for ages. This is one of the reasons why we have pre-positioning of military equipment in Norway. And this is why we develop a very, very close military and security cooperation with the United States. So this is understood, and of course, the more we share the situational awareness about the situation in the area, the more Norway is able to provide solid intelligence on the developments in our area, the more credible our case will be if it should come to that. So, summing up, in terms of conventional threats, I tend to believe that we are in the right place also when it comes to the decision making. Much has indeed been done, and although bewildering it is, I think we will be able to reach the right decisions. In terms of new threats, much more remains, and it will take longer to get to the end of that. And of course, in that respect also, issues like cooperation with other organizations, first and foremost the European Union, which might have a larger role to play when it comes to the resilience part of countering threat scenarios, and also partners comes into play. My final point being that, I mean, there is a lot of talk about Article 5, Article 4, but there's also an Article 3 in the Washington Treaty, stating very clearly the responsibility of every ally to develop their capacity to resist armed attack. And the sooner, my point being that the sooner an ally must ask for assistance from NATO or from allies, the more complicated it will be, and the sooner that ally will risk losing control of the crisis itself. So I stop there. Thank you.